The underbelly of dressage saddle design, fashion and function. Welcome to this series on saddle design. I'm Ian Bitstrup, a spinal rehabilitation veterinarian who for 20 years was the lead presenter, instructor and manual editor for the accredited saddle fitters of Australasia. Enjoy. In the final part of this rundown on saddle design, we look at girth options for the dressage saddle. We discuss the idea of relying on your horse to pick a suitable saddle. To finish off, we look at the key take-home messages from this whole series on saddle design. The girth points and billets, there's variability that we've got to look at. Obviously, where the girth is going to lie in this horse and this horse are totally the opposite extreme. In this racehorse, it's coming down here. In this horse, it's coming here in front of or just behind the elbow. So not there, but there. So we've got to actually be able to accommodate to these different notches. And to do so, where you've got a forward girth notch, you need a forward fitting for your saddle. So this is where tree point fittings come in. So this is an option that's really important. Most saddles either have them or can accommodate for them, or they can be added later by a good saddler. The other option that is important, I think, is to allow this fitting here to slide backwards and forwards. When you're using these 2 points on a horse that has got a more lifted belly, then you need to be able to slide this one back, and where you've got using the front point, you need to be able to keep it slid forward. The aim is that you've got to always have these points vertical. If you have points that are angular, it will pull the saddle forward onto the shoulder blade all the time, just by simple physics. This one, billet option here, where you've got 3 different billets all together, can work for horses that have got a more backward notch. This one, not as well, but just on the borderline. While we're at it, I should mention this girth. This girth is only as effective as that little band in the middle. The side bits are really only fluff that are just added to make it look better, but it's effectively only 2.5 centimeters, at the most 3 centimeters wide. Avoid girths that are cut in like that. They're not going to work that well for the horse. They're going to look okay. They're going to get out of the way of the elbow perhaps, but no, they're not very comfortable for the horse. In the case of monoflap saddles, then we can have a real problem where the points are stitched in. See, this one's already on an angle. That one's coming straight down perpendicularly. That one's on an angle. It's going to pull the saddle forward. So it's not working ideally in most situations. This one is accommodated for having a tree point strap by having a variable or a movable rear point as well. So it can work with both middle and back or front and back quite well. Here we're really stuck with just middle points. So the horses have really got to be quite fit and have a backward girth notch rather than a forward one for this to work. As I've mentioned along the way, this sort of square corner of the sternum, the costochondral junction, is where horses really feel the pressure. And you can see here we've had pressure damage coming over. This is underneath the skin is the ascending pectoral muscle, which is quite prone to soreness, and over tightening of the girth has led to this. I've found racehorses that have had really bruised muscles in this area here. When we do thermography, this area shows the greatest heat quite often, and Russell himself has done some very nice research showing, with pressure mats, showing the pressure over this area here is not the same as what is up further along the rib cage. So we need to protect this square corner. As I mentioned, this girth is not a particularly good example of one to protect it. To protect the horse, we ideally need a girth that's 12 to 15 centimeters wide over this part of the corner of the rib cage. And we need to match it carefully to the shape of the horse's chest. So the fitter event is going to have a less circumference towards the rear and more towards the front. And the average horse is going to have the opposite. It's going to have a lesser circumference towards the front and more towards the rear. because the abdominal shape is quite the opposite. A standard straight through girth can work for 50% of the horses quite well, as long as it sort of meets those criteria. A sheepskin or fleece cover can make it more comfortable for the horse, and I think that's a good idea because many horses are prone to hypersensitivity through this area associated with upper thoracic spinal dysfunction. And I say that because when I treat the spinal dysfunction and rehabilitate horses from it, this sensitivity diminishes dramatically. So it's not just an idea. Ideally, we should have a custom girth for each horse with it anatomically shaped, even though that is prone to trouble as horses change chest shape with weight loss and weight gain and with changes in fitness and back pain levels. So they'll change their bottom line, if you like, with various situations. For your average hack with a bit of belly, when using a straight girth, most often there will be a need for a front or tree point girth billet to be used, and the front buckle will need to be one hole higher than the one of the rear girth billet. So it'll have less of a circumference in front, so you'll actually have to take it up one hole on at least one side, if not both sides of the horse, to get the tension from front to back right. So with the girth, it's very important to do a bit of a home test if you can't get your saddle fitter there in time. But the things that you've got to look for is how the girth is matching down its length. We need to start at this point, make sure it's not digging into the horse, and then working our way down. In this case, the girth is not really touching much here, which is great, and not really touching much on the angle. It's a girth that's got a pad on it, so it's actually lifting away. But what you've really got to check on your girth is whether this part here is cutting into the horse on that sternal corner that I've been talking about. And make sure that when you're feeling from one side to another, there's equal tension on the front as there is on the back. If it's not equal tension, then you're going to have the girth putting too much pressure on one side. And this is typical of when an anatomical girth that's made for a fit eventer is used on a horse that's, say, got a big belly. That sort of girth is going to cut in at the back and be floppy at the front. Also, girths that cut in a little bit too quickly from being broad at the chest and then cutting in to allow elbow freedom will often put too much pressure on the sternal angle down at this point here. There are some straight girths that really transition quickly from being broader at the sternum to being narrower behind the elbow to allow elbow room. Sadly, this area often seems to cut in and be uncomfortable for horses down at that sternal corner that we're talking about, so beware of those. They can be a real problem in some horses. Anatomical girths have been a great advantage for fit adventers and other horses that have got more of a shape of this racehorse than they have of our average horse. In horses like the one shown on the right, the front of a straight girth needs to extend further than the back edge. Therefore, having additional space at the front and a smaller circumference at the rear in these anatomical girths significantly aids the distribution of the load of the girth over a larger surface area at the crucial sternal borders and around the whole girth for that matter. However, it's really important to be cautious if your horse doesn't have a fit eventer shape, because your horse's circumference is going to be quite different from front to back than this horse. This one's bigger at the front and smaller at the back. The average horse that we ride around is smaller at the front and bigger at the back. So quite the opposite to what these sort of anatomical girths are made for. And if we use these sort of girths on our average horse, what will happen is the front will be floppy and the back will cut into the belly of the horse and make them really uncomfortable. They might jam them down more, might make their shoulders more prominent and stop saddles moving forward, but that's all via bad means. So very much avoid using the wrong shaped girth for your horse. So we want to keep the pressure off the sternal corners, and the following are a couple of examples of how we are able to do that with different girths. So this is a girth that actually has a big plate going over the sternum, and you can see here, and also a big plate on the side that's minimizing the actual pressure on the corner of the sternum. So that's one way we can do it. Using a sheepskin liner is a good thing to add to those ones. And another way of doing it is using a pad between the sternum to lift the actual girth points off the angle of the sternum and protect it in that regard. And so there are a couple of examples of what you can do. Girths with elastic can be a bit of a problem child, or it can be a good thing. It just depends on how they're used. If you've got elastic that's quite readily stretched, it can act a bit like a bunchy strap and really tighten against the horse. So you can use too much force in tightening the girth, and the horses can be literally cut in two by the girth. And that is certainly not what any of us want. We don't want our horses hurt. If the girth has just got elastic on one side, the recommendation is actually to put it on the opposite side, so you are less likely to over tighten this. Even better is to use elastic that's really quite firm and doesn't stretch very much at all. It allows a little give, but it doesn't give that much give that you could have your saddle loosened in cases of high movement and the saddle shift on you. There are pads that alter saddle fit that I should comment on too. Remember, we want to avoid putting any pressure up here in the upper part of the wither. So we really need to have pads that don't come up as high. If we're using something like this, we need to cut back this upper portion and bevel it off so the pad doesn't lift it too high into the wither. This pad should go in the lower portion here and avoid pressure up high up against the higher wither. And for that matter, Joyce Harmon did it very well, showing in her book on pain-free back and saddle fit that adding more and more pads here actually moves the saddle up and moves it into a more damaging point there as far as putting pressure over the top of the wither. So avoid putting too much under the saddle when there's no atrophy there, particularly if there's atrophy. Filling the spaces is certainly desirable, and these sort of pads can help in that regard, but they need to be used carefully. So I'm using this horse that's got quite a lot of muscle atrophy as a bit of an example here, but this horse would need a lot more than just a shim to support the saddle in the front. You would need an extra pad as well. Normally we prefer these horses to be exercised well enough to actually build up this area before we actually go into riding. But it's a good mannequin for showing where wither shims should be used. They shouldn't be used above that red line into the spinalis area. They should be used at the base of the wither, and normally we would slip them in between the saddle cloth and the saddle. The ones we most commonly use are 15 mils thick and of a foam that is similar to muscle in nature. And if you go into my spinal bed education channel, you'll see a whole video dedicated to the use of wither shims. Before I finish off, I wanted to comment on getting the horse to pick the right saddle. This I find is a big trap very often. In my experience of working with horse back pain and saddle fitting over the last 30 years, contrary to popular belief, horses are generally not that great at picking saddles that are going to be comfortable over the longer term. They're great at picking ones that feel good at the time, and sometimes just changing the saddle footprint from one that they're used to something different. Like I've had a client recently that was having a bit of trouble with her horse's horse's soreness, and she put a different saddle on it, a saddle that she knew was considerably wider than was appropriate for the horse. The horse went considerably better in it for a while, but then started deteriorating again, and deteriorating significantly. It's a matter of moving the pain footprint sometimes. So that saddle that the horse seemed to think was good maybe just not pressing on the areas that it was subject to pain with its previous saddle. The other thing is, be wary that some saddles are made to be cushy right from the start for the rider and the horse, and some saddles are made to be worn in, so to speak, a bit more like the older style saddles. So just be wary that it's not just that it feels cushy just like a lovely new pair of runners that actually aren't the best runners for you, but they feel lovely and cushy, and so you bought them, but there were others that were actually quite a lot better for you. One of the things I find is that too often saddles seem to be good for the horse for 3 weeks and maybe up to 3 months, and then the horses start showing obvious behaviour problems and start losing muscle over their back and start deteriorating in other ways in their performance. And because the saddle has been changed, they get the saddle fitter out and the saddle may be tuned up a bit, and then the horse will be improved for another couple of weeks maybe, and then they progressively go back to this bad behaviour that's developing, and that increases over time. But they think, well, I've had a new saddle that the horse was very happy with, I've had it checked, everything should be fine. And it's not the saddle, it's something else that's going on with the horse. And sadly, that's quite the opposite to what really is happening. It's just that these saddles that had a different pain footprint are creating their own pain footprint now. What can also be dangerous about getting the horse to pick the right saddle is that saddles that are really quite suitable are ruled out because the horse sort of said no. And they said no because it was similar to their old saddle in some respects. And that can mean that you've lost an opportunity to use a saddle that was more appropriate for them. Sometimes too, a saddle is well suited to a horse, but it's not actually fitted appropriately to the horse at the time. And it's out of balance, and the horse doesn't feel good with it because it's out of balance, and the rider doesn't feel good with it because it's out of balance. But all it needs is fitting more appropriately to actually try it out properly. And this is one of the real problems with trying your mate's saddle on your horse to see whether it is working, whether it's a saddle you'd like to buy, or getting one online and not having it fitted properly before you try it out and then giving up on it because it's actually not been well balanced. Or it can be that the saddle fitter just didn't do a great job even though they were trying hard. They didn't actually balance it properly, or they didn't account for the fact that the flock was going to drop a lot more than they thought, or something like that. So just be really wary of the situation where you try saddles. Make sure it's in the right situation, the right fitting is done, not just a half-hearted sort of fitting done to check it. Because if you're out of balance, you're not going to like the saddle, and likewise the horse isn't. So the key take-home messages for selecting a saddle for your horse include picking saddles that avoid the more sensitive areas of your horse's back, so the tips of the vertebrae, of course, the upper part of the wither here where the muscle can be compressed against the bone, the small spinal muscles along through the saddle seat area in particular, protecting the small muscles over the angle of the rib cage, the dorsal serratus muscles, back of the scapula or shoulder blade cartilage, and also where the part of the serratus ventralis muscle, a very important supportive muscle, joins the back of the shoulder blade. And if your horse hasn't got a particularly strong and flat back that's going to support you no matter what, then you need to avoid pressure over the back of the rib cage where the rib cage and the loin join. We need to maximise the support of the rider's weight via maximum surface area. We're not going to go back to this sort of saddle, I know that. We need better panel than this though, and we need to avoid this cutback shoulder sort of setup where you're going to minimise the support through a critical area of the saddle construction. And we want to maximise or increase the support through the waist rather than having it nice and neat and small like this one. We also need to be mindful of monoflap saddles not necessarily supporting the panels right through this area here, and as a result not performing as well as we would hope. Ideally, we'll have saddles that don't put any pressure into this upper area here, that have nice long tree points to support the front panel, that don't have short tree points that are going to necessitate high panel contact and are going to cause more pressure over the critical area of the wither. Also, we want to avoid saddles that don't support the rider's weight through the saddle seat very well, that have a minimum of panel there. They might seem a good idea to fit it within the rib cage, but it's a disaster for the horse. This is loading the weakest part of the horse's back, as this saddle is here too, as a fulcrum right on this area. And lastly, please don't underestimate the value of spending money on a comfortable girth, especially one that minimises the pressure over those sternal corners that I was talking about, the costochondral junction. So we've been through saddle design and function. Thanks for your interest in this topic. In the interest of horse welfare, I believe it to be a highly important one. I hope this presentation gives riders a much greater appreciation of what they're sitting on, and also helps them make a better informed and better choice on behalf of the horses they love. So if you found this useful to you, there is more information on saddle design, saddle trauma and saddle fit, and other videos on this and related subjects that are freely available on my YouTube Spinal Vet Education channel. Happy viewing.